In 2020, virtual meetings went mainstream. But what effects have virtual meetings really had on the business world in general? The answer is not as straightforward as you might think. Hello, my name is Lauren Sergi, and this is Talk Shop Interviews, where we get to discuss issues affecting communication in the working world with experts from a variety of industries. So much in business communication had to change when the pandemic hit, and predictions about the effects of virtual meetings on businesses abounded. From ideas about the financial impacts that it might have, to the effects of Zoom on travel and working arrangements, to whether virtual would continue to be important after we return to the office, everyone seemed to have an opinion about how virtual meetings have changed the working world. But what has the effect of virtual on our businesses really been? Has everyone realized untold savings due to lowered costs or reduced travel? Who has been affected by these changes? And what impact might virtual meetings continue to have going forward? To discuss these issues and more, I am delighted to introduce my favorite business and finance prognosticator, Abdur Nimeri. Abdur Nimeri is the Chief Investment Officer at UMB Family Wealth and is an expert in financial market performance. Abdur holds a PhD in physical chemistry from Ohio State University and a master's degree in financial mathematics from the University of Chicago. He is experienced at crunching numbers, looking at trends, and using data to see what could be around the corner in business and finance. He is a distinguished speaker in the financial services industry, has been a frequent guest on CNBC, and is an accomplished competitive wrestler who qualified for the world team. Welcome, Abdur Nimeri, my friend, to Talk Shop. I am so happy to have you here. And one thing about you and what you do is that you kind of forecast. You forecast stuff. You are my oracle into the future for what is going to be happening in companies, in the markets. If it has to do with finance stuff, you are the oracle there. So with all of the discussions that have been going on regarding virtual meetings, with the fact that we have been doing nothing but virtual meetings for well over a year now, I am curious, how do you feel about them right now? Have virtual meetings been the game-changing technology that everyone said, oh, this is going to change how we do business around the world? Have they really been the game-changing technology, or is there impact on how companies are working and the bottom lines of companies, really all that?
It's interesting you ask that question, because we talk about this a lot in our leadership meetings. The question around, coming back to work, et cetera, what that may or may not look like. And a lot of that does hinge on the increased utilization of virtual meetings. And so if you think in terms of going to a 2-3 split day, weekly split, that does hinge a lot on the idea of having more non-in-person meetings, which means they'll be virtual. Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit mixed on it. And the reason is, I think there definitely is an impact on the bottom line when it comes to real estate, company staffing, et cetera, and nimbleness of companies to actually have meetings. But also there's a piece where I think for more client facing, there will be a retraction of utilization of things like virtual meetings. And so mainly because there's some that you just can't replicate in an in-person meeting that you can do virtually. So I think there's definitely frictions around that. But that being said, what we have seen, we've seen almost like a warp speed to virtual meetings. It's been warp speed. Yeah. There's been a bit of it happen over time. WebEx was there, Skype meetings were there, then Teams came online, Zoom, etc. So the industries have been moving towards that. But let's be clear, there are a lot of industries that are, from my observation, are not necessarily currently designed for remote management and remote work. The one that sort of comes to mind is probably uniquely designed for it is probably IT and technology. Yeah. They've been managing teams globally for a very long time. And so where other teams where you have to sort of have interface to either see context or just to sort of have that culture building, is very different. Like in banking and financial services, a lot more culture building needed than say, I would say, industries like IT, not the dog on IT or anything like that, but it is a very different industry when how they interact, how they engage. They've been engaging virtually for decades, if not longer. Whereas I think for financial services and a lot of other industries, things like marketing, where there's a lot more personal interaction, I think they've struggled with the virtual meetings. It's become a lot more questionable how those will be enduring for those industries as well. So I think you're going to have this sort of, I don't say cyclical piece where some industries will do it extremely well and very nimble. Some will struggle to do it, and some will sort of be in the middle ground. So you're going to have this sort of mosaic of things that happen. From a bottom line perspective, I think there's a value. Mm-hmm. I think we have realized that there's certain functions that don't necessarily need to be in the brick and mortar all the time. There's just some functions that really don't need to do that. And what we haven't seen a substantial drop in productivity. I would say we've seen a ramp up because now people are now moving their days up and down. So they may be working slightly more in the morning because of the virtual meetings, moving around that. They may be working more on the upside as well. And so the productivity is still pretty high and frothy at this point. So we haven't seen a retraction of that across the industries. So I definitely think the bottom line has not been hurt by the virtual meetings at all. Mm-hmm. And so there can be some upside of how we navigate it as we continue to move through. One thing to consider, and I'm sort of going on at this point, but one thing to really consider,
go on, that's
as you know,
here.
We've been working for a while. One thing to really consider is how companies adapt to the remote workspace and outside just the virtual meetings. A lot has been put on sort of virtual meetings, but it all translates to sort of work from home and work from home spaces. And what does that mean for corporate productivity and profitability as well? So I think there are two questions to be asked. One is the virtual meeting, what we're doing right now. We're having this virtually, and understand exactly how beneficial this is. It does allow people to engage a lot more freely. What I have found is that it allows people to actually take meetings a lot more freely. Because now I don't have to sort of mobilize my time, organize my time to actually get from point A to point B. We have meetings right now, they're in-person meetings, and we always book driving time.
Yes.
Could be 30 minutes. So I have an hour and a half meeting, driving time is an hour, half hour on one side, half hour on the other side. If you think about much of my day is now consumed in that time, it's quite substantial. Now what we've done is that we say, okay, well, I could take a half hour meeting during that drive that I wasn't really going to be able to, I wasn't comfortable taking before. Because I questioned the effectiveness of it, but I find it is actually quite effective. So I take a half hour meeting here, half hour meeting there, again, lead to more productivity. So I think there's some advantage to adopting a remote work or a virtual policy to allow people to actually capture some of that time, but also you collapse that time as well. So now my hour meeting is truly an hour meeting.
Yeah.
It's not flanked by two half-hour drive times on either side, which makes it now a 2-hour meeting of, in most cases, not getting very much done in general. So I think it definitely does have an impact on the bottom line. And it's going to stay with us for a while too.
Oh, yes. I like to say the genie is out of the bottle. It's not going back. And of course, with the pandemic being that main factor for everyone adopting virtual, I feel that it forced a lot of those long tail adopters, one that said, this isn't right for our industry. This isn't right for how our company works. It forced them to try it. Whether or not they keep it up to this degree, once people can come back into the office, they still tried it and realized it might not have been the big scary monster than it was originally perceived to be. Now, you brought up something really, really interesting about how this is affecting different industries, as possibly even as well as different functions within a single company in different ways. Of course, with IT, it's kind of like they're now just able to rampage through their own sandbox. They're used to interfacing this way. They're used to this interaction. But when it comes to what I would consider very strongly trust-based industries, like your industry, the financial sector, like the marketing industry, where that face-to-face interaction is part of the trust and relationship development. Do you think that there will be less of a demand? I mean, are they more likely to go back to in person than other organizations? Or are there people within the company, say CEOs and executives, who are more likely to be more in person than other functions within that company? You know, is there I'm guessing I'm asking, is there a disparate effect within a single organization as to who is using virtual or who gets to be remote versus who doesn't?
Yeah, I see two pieces around that. And so the trust factor is huge. And people typically glean trust from in-person interaction, personal interactions as well. But also, I think you could probably agree, trust is something that happens over longer tracks of time as well. They don't happen in a vacuum. They don't happen in very small sound bites. And so you can think in terms of, if I've built the relationship over a long period of time, it doesn't matter if I'm virtual or in person. Well, I already have the trust factor. Okay. The medium in which I engage with the client at that point is actually not as relevant. Building that relationship now becomes very critical. So now if my business model is built on building trust before I can get to executing the job or the deliverable that I have for a client, that's where it becomes very tricky. It's harder to, I think, build trust through a virtual mechanism than it is through an in-person mechanism. And so it doesn't mean that you have to have one or the other. I think you're still going to have the bifurcated case where you have virtual and in person. I could see an opportunity where those that are more client-facing have to generate more business for businesses. Okay, go out to meet clients, et cetera. That piece will be on the front end. But I think supplemental meetings now will be able to go virtual once the trust is built. So now you can create more, whereas in general, those supplemental meetings would have been in person as well.
Yeah.
And so you would have had a meeting one day, the next meeting would have been in person, the next meeting would have been in person. Next thing you know, you're meeting in person 12 times a year. Or now you can collapse that down. You may meet in person maybe 3 to 6 times a year, and the rest virtual. The key to that is that it allows a lot more flexibility. And I'll give you a quick example. I was chatting with a good friend of mine who's a program director at the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And so what he does is he brings together scientists to either approve grants or write grants, et cetera, for people that are looking for grants from NIH. And what he found is that it was easier to get some of the people who wanted with the virtual mechanism than to get them to leave their cities for 2 or 3 days to come to DC or come to a satellite city to work with a committee and get things done. The same thing with clients. If I have clients that are all over the country, sometimes it's much easier to get them on a call or a WebEx than to actually try to get everyone into a plane, mobilize that, actually fly to a location, make sure they're available. All those things that add incremental cost and time and complexity now it can be collapsed in a 30 or 45-minute Zoom call. So I think that clients find it a lot more flexible as well. The onboarding process, again, as I mentioned, the onboarding process for clients will always be, I think, there's always an advantage to in-person for onboarding. There's always going to be an advantage around that. But once the onboarding happens, once the relationship is built, I think now you'll see a deceleration into things like, virtual meetings. You'll see it, I think, with CEOs. You'll see it with, CEOs, the entire C-suite. They'll find ways to maybe start to have meetings instead of making that trip all the way to Australia for a client meeting. You may Zoom into that meeting.
Right.
And so I think that's where you'll see some advantages around that. Again, the efficiency around it, the speed in which you can have them. I think it just adds to what we currently do in business in general. So I think it's additive. It doesn't take away at all.
Yeah. And what you might see, what I figure you'll see a lot of is those in-person meetings that'll happen at the first major contact. So when we sit down for 2 or 3 hours and really chew through a project, really chew through that potential partnership or that client relationship, and then much later down the process, when that service contract or whatever it is you're doing with people, when that contract gets signed. And again, these are completely my own theories as to when it's important to have that face-to-face. Right. So the effort has been made to fly to Australia because today we are signing that contract for X number of millions in services being delivered. And it is important to be there. The inconvenience becomes part of the show, part of that demonstration that, yes, I strongly value you. Now, lots of little savings are happening here and there. So there's, time in terms of travel cost. Of course, that can be really significant for many companies. There's savings there in terms of cost of lease space. If you're able to downsize the amount of real estate your organization needs to function, there are savings there. Are there any unforeseen costs that you've noticed coming up in the adoption to virtual, stuff that people haven't necessarily thought of, but might take away from all of those juicy savings we were eyeballing?
I think one cost that I haven't really heard too much about is data and data retention.
Mm-hmm.
And so how that will impact certain things. And so right now we have your data retention policies that you save certain emails. And I remember several years ago, there was a policy around getting rid of emails after 60 days or 30 days. So some time, like 60 or 90 days, I forget what the actual number was. But it really was acknowledging the fact that for every email that I have, I need this space for that email. Okay. Which actually incurs costs. Okay. I need hard drive space. All these are cost functions. And so the bigger question I have, and it may be sort of this odd question, I think about this recorded call here.
Yeah.
Takes a lot of bandwidth. This video will actually take a lot of memory space to store.
My free terabyte on OneDrive is almost used up. I have to buy some more.
Bingo, exactly. As that fills up, okay, that becomes an expense for companies. But I think companies right now are not necessarily recording Zoom calls internally or externally, maybe due to client privacies, et cetera. But I think at some point it does become the question is that, are you looking to retain some of the information either from internal calls, okay, or even client calls, similar to like you take notes in client calls, what that may or may not look like and what the cost of that will look like for storing data, packets of data as you record them. Again, I haven't heard a lot about this because I think that there's not a lot going on in it, but I would sense that, especially in professions like the legal profession, where depositions now may be virtual, and you have to record those depositions and store those depositions, it becomes a lot more expensive. And so I think things like that will become things that you have to think about from an expense perspective. What that number may look like, I don't know. But what I do know is that if there's concern about keeping my emails for over 90 days, and that has to do with space and storage, I find it difficult to believe that there won't be concerns about having to store packets of video data on corporate servers and not incurring more and more costs for corporations. Because I think my text-based email is a lot smaller than even this video that we're doing right now for 30, 45 minutes.
For sure. That's and those tech costs can really balloon out. They really, quite unexpectedly too, if it just becomes standard practice. Well, of course we record all of our meetings because we want to refer to them later. It wouldn't take long for a large company or even a medium-sized company to quickly be spending vast sums on that storage. Buy your brand new data storage unit out in Arizona, out in the desert or something, because you'll be filling those servers up.
Well, exactly. I mean, but that'll drive other industries like cloud computing as well, and cloud storage. And so there are other areas where you'll see these offshoots, but definitely I do think that there is a question around expense. And what that may not look like. An area that we haven't really touched on is sort of the ability, what has happened now I'm very interested in this here. A lot of schools have now started to, because of the pandemic, because of virtual, they had to deliver their value prop via video, via Teams or via Zoom, via WebEx, et cetera. I do wonder, privacy at my own home late at night, I have nothing else to do. I do wonder if this will become a revenue stream for a lot of universities as well, to really start to beef up and offer online programming. An area where universities have traditionally struggled to actually do online programming. A lot have struggled significantly. Will this be an opportunity to now deliver the value prop in an online fashion? And so as they navigate through, the pandemic and COVID-19, have they found other tools to be able to distribute their value prop more globally? And I'm not just speaking about colleges. I'm also thinking about some of your high-end and well-regarded high schools as well,
Mm-hmm.
as a way to distribute their content in a virtual fashion to maybe have sort of, the student who's enrolled at your school, but they're doing your school from Singapore. So they're a high school student, but they're in Singapore. But they will ultimately get their high school degree from your school, but they do it all online. Same thing with colleges and universities. I think this does open opportunity for those organizations to now rethink the value prop of online education versus in-person education and the value related to that. Because we have seen a difference in that as well. A lot of people have the question, well, why should I pay the same amount for online school that I pay for in-person school? And I wanted a discount. And so my point was almost a self-defeating argument, because that implies that you're admitting that there is a reason to charge the upper level for in-person education. And so that's the flip side of the argument, is that you can now discount the virtual program and now justify the in-person program being what it is. And so now you have two revenue streams for schools. One that is market driven, based on what the virtual desires look like and the demand for that. But I think that is an area where you can see a lot of uptake for a lot of people who, may be sitting in, Wilton, Iowa, and they have the grades, they have everything it needs to be a stellar student attention. Thomas Jefferson in Virginia, but they just don't want to relocate to Virginia.
Right.
And so things like that, there may be ways in which you can sort of enhance that education and broaden it out to a much broader population.
And you're likely speaking to two very different markets there as well. The virtuals are looking to go virtual for very specific reasons. The value proposition for the in-person is completely different. We see that kind of segmentation in events as well. There's a certain perception of the value of being at an in-person event. Yes, you're paying for the rubber chicken, but there's meaning there, and people are willing to pay more for their ticket, even if they could cook a much better meal for themselves had they done that conference at home. There's definitely those different value propositions there. What do you think this does in terms of the ability for smaller companies to compete with larger companies if they are able to distribute their services online? Because something that I've noticed is, as companies got more comfortable with the idea of online virtual training, they're willing to look outside of the usual suspects. This company can send 3 trainers out here next week, or we can go virtual and people are comfortable with it now. So does this really change business competition between smaller service providers and larger companies? Or again, do things kind of equal out in the end because they serve different markets?
I think it's democratized it, to be honest. I think smaller companies tend to have a nimbleness that larger companies don't necessarily always have. Not saying they don't have, but a lot of times they actually have more inertia when they're trying to get things done. So I think it's democratized a lot, because what we did see during this sort of shift to digital programming was the nimbleness of so many small companies to move very quickly, to change business models very quickly on the dime. And the reason is that they're hyper specialized. The bigger you get, the less specialization you end up incurring. So you end up with multiple verticals of revenue. You have to pick and choose how you distribute those assets across those individual verticals. A lot of smaller companies are very, very focused on what they do. And so what we've seen is that everyone now does a small piece of the pie. Some may do video conferencing, some may do audio conferencing, some may do video streaming. Everyone does their slice. And so when you cobble them together, you have a complete mosaic. But I think it's allowed for democratization. It's allowed for smaller players to actually get a seat at the table to a large extent, because they're hyper specialized. Now, the bigger question really becomes, do the bigger players ultimately buy the smaller players and absorb them internally? I think that's definitely a question on the table. But no, I think that the smaller players will have a seat at the table, will continue to be able to compete and compete very well. And so we have small companies, we have middle-sized companies, and we have big companies. We're seeing it not just we're seeing it in the financial services. We're seeing it in the credit card space. Corporate cards look very different than they used to. There are a lot more corporate card providers out there. In general, there used to be really one gold standard. Everyone had an Amex. Now you're seeing a lot more. That's true. That was the gold standard, and those can have views about if this continues to be the gold standard at this point or not. That's more of a debatable question, negative or positive. But the reality is that there are other providers now that are smaller, that are offering other things that actually are just as attractive. So the competitive landscape definitely is starting to change. Technology has changed a lot of that. So I think there's definitely room for smaller players. And I'd be very hard pressed to think that's going to go away in the next cycle or anytime soon.
Yeah, I much like you, I don't think that trend is going to go anywhere. I think what will be really interesting to watch is, again, that value proposition of the in-person. So
Yes.
where you'll see that continued competition is perhaps the smaller provider can deliver all of these things virtually, no problem. They have a good relationship. The service seeker likes them, but this bigger company has an office where that service seeker is. So how might that bigger company then position the value of being on site? Do they understand their work climate better?
Right.
Can they develop a better relationship? And it's not that there is an answer as to what is better. It's just going to be how people position themselves. And I, for one, am really curious to see how that positioning dance between the smaller providers who are virtual versus the large providers who are truly globally, physically present, are able to kind of work against one another. I think it's going to be
cool. I guess the way I think about it is that Amazon really does not have a physical presence.
No, they don't.
Okay.
Or do they? Those damn boxes are everywhere, Abdur.
The box but they don't have a physical sales presence really to the end consumer. Okay. And so they have it at their corporate level. They do have that as they interface with companies, but the end consumer, they don't really have a physical presence. Facebook doesn't have a physical presence. And so I think that the certain companies don't really need a physical presence to be successful and or to be profitable. Now, if you're selling vacuum cleaners, that's maybe slightly different than selling technology and sort of a platform to facilitate business through. Okay, so that sales process and mechanism is very different. Mm-hmm. And so, because most people in those areas, they're just looking to make sure the technology works. It's not as necessarily important that we built this trust-based rapport. Does technology work? Yes or no? And so does it execute on what I need to do? Yes or no? And also, smaller companies are not necessarily resistant to in-person meetings. Mm-hmm. They'll get on a plane just like everyone else. And they may get on the plane faster.
Yeah.
And so I think that they're going to still have that sort of piece between in-person and virtual meetings as well. So I think that's going to go across the board, no matter if you're big, small, medium, et cetera, or mega. Where I think that you're going to see is that at the end of the day, certain firms are starting to realize that the in-person meeting may not be as critical as their original assumptions thought they were. It doesn't mean they're not important. Okay. It says if I were to weight the importance of in-person meeting, sales, execution, and delivering on a client's objectives and goals, more than likely the in-person meeting is going to dampen in value relative to the other three. Okay. And I think that's what we've realized this past year and a half or so. That if I just do a weighting, being a scientist, I typically do a weighting function and I say, okay, what's important to the client? In-person meeting, product, sales, execution, communication. Okay. And I weight all these. They're not equally weighted for every client.
No.
And what you'll find is that a lot of clients have realized I need execution. I need communication. I need to be able to get a hold of technology or sales when I need them, and also support when I need them. all those functions right now in most organizations are not done in person. So I think now this piece here, this variable of in person, has actually diminished in importance for a lot of your end users. So that's really the question. What does the end user need? Not what the company needs to make itself feel good. Okay. What does the end user need to make the buy decision? And I think that the variable around in-person meeting has actually gotten slightly smaller.
Yeah.
I think it's gotten slightly smaller because now people are saying, do I really want to spend an hour in an in-person meeting? And these are consumers that are saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Not just the consumer saying, do I really want to spend an hour and a half in a meeting? And so I'm in meetings now, and I can tell when the meeting is starting to get too long. Okay, because at the end of the day, they're busy. Everyone's busy.
Yeah.
And they're trying to get time back. They're trying to get time back. They're trying to get time back. And so they're trying to reposition their lifestyle as well for things like family, recreation, all these other things. And now we're fitting business into that as well. So I think, just again, as I mentioned earlier, the variables that are set in stone that we use to evaluate what's important to a client, I think that we have to realize the fact that the in-person meeting has diminished in value for a lot of our clients.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's across multitude of industries. And so the big question is going to be is what happens with things like international travel and business travel for the airlines. The airlines they make most of their bulk on business travel internationally. That's where most of their bulk. So those are all in-person meetings. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that data changes. You know, if we start to see the sales on international travel, international travel sort of doesn't get back to pre-pandemic levels, to me, that would be a pretty good indicator that there's not that the demand has dropped to have someone fly from Chicago to Frankfurt to have an in-person meeting. Mm-hmm. And incur costs of being in Frankfurt for almost a week and a half or so. That to me is, as we get that data as it comes in, I think we'll get a better sense of how we're thinking about virtual meetings and the impact, and how the consumer, at the end of the day, we're all driving we're looking for what the consumer demands are, and see if the consumer still demands that. I think we talk about what company culture, what companies want, et cetera, but no one has really asked the question, are consumers demanding to see their representatives in their office? And I'm not sure that they are.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that they are.
I'm not sure that they are either. I loved that comment that you made about not just doing what makes the company feel good, because that does really distract from that end consumer issue. And, you know, thinking years back to my past life as the world's worst librarian, it's true. We would have vendors, mostly database vendors, come in for these in-person meetings. And quite often it was, you know, from their standpoint, it was high value because they're here, they're building the trust, and they were lovely people. Genuinely enjoyed seeing them. But very often from our perspective, it was annoying because we knew that we would then be spending half a day to politely show them around and do all of the things and go for lunch and go for coffee after lunch and on, because they had traveled all that way. So there was a politeness show around it too, that in the end, I think often just wasted everybody's time.
And that's my point.
Yeah.
It's really locating of all the things that we deliver to a client, be it in-person meetings, all the way down to a finished product. Okay, what does the client truly value? Okay, and pull that away from what I think they value. And so now there's a piece where you want to have corporate culture emanating at the corporate level. Mm-hmm. Okay, so everyone's back in the office, everyone's working together efficiently, everything is moving. But to your question really is, does that truly generate culture, or is it the optic of culture? That's a big question. Is it truly culture being generated, or is it optic of culture?
Yeah.
And also, you know, what culture are you really trying to create? Because at the end of the day, if we're really moving towards this business, if we're moving towards a time where we will have this two models of working virtually and non-working virtually, then the culture is going to have to change.
Yeah.
And so trying to maintain culture, is the question, because are we going where the puck is, or are we staying where the puck is right now today? We ultimately want to be where the puck is going, where the puck is going to land up. And I think the puck is ultimately going to land on this sort of two models of work from home and work in the office. I think that's where it's ultimately going to land. And so that culturally is going to look very different than the culture of everyone working in the office. It's going to just be culturally different. And so because that's why IT is culturally different than banking and finance. It truly is. It's culturally different.
We can look at that. IT is culturally different, even within the same organization. That just suddenly struck me, actually, because I do work with people from different departments very often. And very often, one of the things they're talking about is, I don't know how to speak to that department. And as stereotypical as it is almost always IT and accounting and operations who don't know how to speak to one another.
Well, but even within that, I mean, if you think in terms of if you look at your typical finance department within an IT company,
mm-hmm.
it's going to culturally look different than your finance department in a banking company, in a banking firm, okay, or an asset manager. It's going to be culturally different, because the culture gets shaped by the broader context of everyone who makes it up. There's a big culture that happens in IT and sort of, in technology. It's been raised very differently than if you're raised in a banking culture. Okay. And so my point is that if we're moving to a scenario where we will have some people work from home, some people not work from home, some people work in the office, and you have this crisscross effect, that in itself will create a very different culture than if you had everyone working in the office opposed to everyone working remotely.
Yeah.
It's just going to be very different. And so that's where it seems that the puck is going across the board. It could be for cost, it could be for efficiency, it could just be for health and wellness. It could be for productivity. There are a lot of things we've been able to see that actually have been beneficial with people working remotely. It could be to reduce carbon emissions, so now commutes have been compressed substantially. One thing that's quite interesting, and this is completely anecdotal. I was talking to someone the other day, and it struck me. We were chatting about the pandemic and people being out of school and all this other stuff, and we realized something that, you ever notice there weren't any colds this winter? It was fascinating. Okay, I don't know anyone who got the cold this winter.
No,
I don't know anyone who got the flu this
sick.
winter either. And so, but it's quite fascinating that we've seen all these other things that have happened as a result of the pandemic. And so the question becomes, when flu season hits, should everyone wear a mask during flu season? Simple questions. Simple, because we did see a absolute reduction of people getting colds and flus because everyone was wearing a mask. Even if they went to school, they wore a mask.
Yeah.
Even in school, they wore a mask. And so I know a lot of people with kids, and they said, my kid didn't get a cold or flu, and they were at school the entire time, and they were during the peak of cold and flu season, no one was getting sick.
Yeah.
And so those things are things that we're starting to think about, or should be starting to think about, things like commute. If you want to talk about climate change or climate risk, how do you net out on it politically? The question is, are we driving more or are we driving less? We did see pollution levels drop during the height of the pandemic when everything was shut down. We saw pollution levels drop. Okay. Is there a narrative to say there should be a sunset where people drive less? Okay. We're seeing people in our organization right now that, because of the pandemic and not having to go to the office, their commute basically is zero. And so their car is not basically active for 5 days a week. And then they do their all their running around on the weekends. And so those are some of the things I think that will be that should be part of the discussion as well, because we do know that people, especially people like in New York here, commute quite substantially to get in and out of the city. And so some live in the city if they can afford it. You know, New York is expensive.
Yeah.
You know, wages haven't really kept up. And some live out of the city and commute in substantially. And so I think that it's going to be more of a narrative, not just around companies and productivities. I think there'll be a question around sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
Does it make sense to have your workers come in 5 days a week? And what's the carbon impact on that? What's the fossil fuel impact on that? What's the climate impact on that? What's the social impact on that as well? You know, are workers happier? You know, dredging in 5 days a week on the subway, coming in and out of the office? Or are they happier being able to have more flexibility? Because most companies already have a flexible schedule. They actually already accommodate for it. But they've cherry picked who will have those flexible schedules.
Yeah.
And so now I think what's ultimately going to happen, I think companies are going to be inundated with requests for flexible schedules. I think that's what's going to happen. Okay. And so companies are just going to have this flood of requests for flexible schedules. And they're going to have to face, okay, what do we do now? When 50% of my workforce has put a request in to work from home every Friday or 1 day a week. It used to not be, that number was nowhere near that high.
Yeah.
You have a couple of people that would do it. But I think now, what's ultimately going to happen, the pushback for companies, people are just going to put the request, you can put the request in. Every company has a ability, you can put the request in. They're going to get inundated with requests in the fall. I think it's ultimately going to happen. And so, and then they're going to have to address, okay, who gets it, who doesn't get it, and they're going to end up with more people getting it than it was pre-pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're going to end up with a situation where you're going to have a significant amount of your workers with a flexible schedule. So you're going to fall there anyway. And I'm not really afraid that culture will be impacted. I think culture just changes.
It'll need to change because you can't have the same kind of culture when people are basically ships passing in the night. You have teams in one day and other teams in another, and they never really have the opportunity to interact. But like you said, it doesn't mean that there isn't a culture. It just means that you need to develop it differently.
It doesn't mean it's not a culture. It doesn't mean that culture is not enduring and reasonable.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that culture in itself is somehow less. I think we have to get rid of that idea, because it doesn't mean it's less or it's less effective or it's not as good as the previous culture. It's just a change. Mm-hmm. It's sort of like the question that, people, when you do hiring, the question you ask is, do they fit the culture? Okay. Well, if I've designed the culture a certain way, and I want it to be a certain way, and I say, well, they don't fit the culture, I end up with, in most cases, pretty much the same people in the same boats all the time. That's what it does with, pretty much the same people in the same boat, because I'm trying to preserve culture. Okay. So, at some point you have to think about what really does mean culture, because what I have found, I'm on the board of I'm on the board of my athletic club, and we started to actually think in terms of, as we think about our athletic programming, we want to make sure that we had voices from people who do all remote programming. We want to make sure we have voice from people that are more senior, more younger, people who live in the suburbs, people who live in the city. Okay. And the reason is that people commute into the club, people only do the remote program. Because what it does, it gives you a very different perspective when I deal with the people that only do the online classes. They never come to the club, they only do online classes. So, because there are people that are like, we don't want online classes. Well, there's a huge demographic that does, and they see it as a value, because from my perspective, when I'm working and I'm traveling, the online program makes sure I don't miss a workout.
Right.
And make sure I don't miss a workout, because I know the online program is being, I can stay on my workout. I can actually keep it going. And so to me, there is a value to it. But I think when we think about culture, and I think that's the fear that most companies have now, when they're battling between work from home and coming back into the office, or remote work, is that the culture will be negatively affected. And I'm less concerned about that, mainly because I think that the culture will just adapt. Humans are resilient, they adapt, you know. And so the culture that we have will just look different, but it'll still be an effective culture. And so I think that's what companies have to start to think about. What is the culture going to look like coming forward when you have people working from home, you know, and people working in the offices on a consistent basis. Another area to really consider, and I have a lot of people that are in IT to talk about this, is how do you now advance people that are purely remote working? That's another big challenge that companies typically have, is the advancement tends to be stymied when you work primarily remotely. And so how do you correct for that? How do you make sure that piece, you know, people still get promoted and still get moved forward in organizations and corporations? I think that's the area that we have to really start to think more about what we do there.
That's a great point. That's a really, really good point. And again, it ties in with what are those effects of the in-person versus virtual only? How are those relationships developed? And so on. Abdur, I could talk to you all day about this. I've got one more quick question, and I want you to answer with your gut. With your gut. You personally, what's your sweet spot for remote versus in-person? If you could orchestrate your own life however you wanted, would it be 100% remote, 100% in person, 60-40? What's your split?
I'd probably say maybe close to 40-60.
40% remote, 60 in person?
The inverse. 40% in person, 60 remote. But that has a lot to do with what I do.
Yes, for sure.
That's a lot to do what I do on the investment management side.
Yeah.
And so so I would say 40-60 for what I do specifically. If I were to purely a sales function, it may pop up to maybe 50-50 or 60-40. But I do think that 40% of your time remote is more than adequate across multiple functions. I think 40% to me would be an upper boundary, a lower boundary what I would do remotely.
Makes sense.
Yes.
Makes sense. So thank you so much again for all of this. It is always fascinating to talk to you because you have that insight, that ability to say, this is what's happening now. Let's project what it means into the future. If other people want access to your giant brain, how can they find you online? Where do you hang out? LinkedIn, social media? How can people find you?
I hang out on LinkedIn. I'm there all the time. I'm posting there all the time. So that's actually the best way to reach out to me is through LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, I will be sure to post the link to your LinkedIn profile down below. Again, Abdur, thank you so much for appearing here on Talk Shop. To everyone else, where do you think that virtual is going to take our companies in the upcoming years? I would love to hear from you. Stick your thoughts, stick your forecasts in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this episode and want to make sure you don't miss the next one, be sure to head over to my website at laurensergi.com, sign up in the pop-up, and you will get my upcoming videos and articles in your email. Again, Abdur, thank you for joining us here on Talk Shop.
Thank you.
And to everyone else, have a great day. Take care.